just while they're taking their seats, a couple of thoughts on Gen AI. A bit of discussion in that prior panel about optimization, and I think part of the drive of that discussion is around productivity, and it put me in mind of Professor Robert Solow. I'm into my professors this morning. Professor Robert Solow, Emeritus Professor of Economics at MIT, who sadly died at age 99, still Emeritus Professor at the age of 99, in December, who said in a paper he wrote in 1989, I think it was, he said, "I see the effects of PCs everywhere except in the productivity stats." His point being that tech is great, but quite often it doesn't quite translate to what we expect when it comes to productivity. So that is a bit of a neat segue into talking about Gen AI, and this was even discussed or raised at the recent WEF by the representative of the papacy. The Vatican representative is a guy called Paolo Benanti, who's a Franciscan friar. He doesn't spend his life sitting in his friary. He's actually an engaged technologist. And his concern was not with whether AI will acquire consciousness or not, but his concern was natural stupidity, not artificial intelligence, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit today. So we're going to talk mainly in this panel about Gen AI because, as David said in the prior panel, we can't not talk about Gen AI. The share price would plummet. Not that we've got a share price, but it would. So before I introduce them, quick Gen AI joke. What do you call a large language model that's been trained on too many cat videos? The perfect machine. Boom. Okay, so our esteemed panellists, from my left to the far right, Anil Vijayan, partner at Everest Group, Toby Goldblatt. I'll let you talk through your myriad achievements, but currently CEO of Renew and prior at Avanade and other things, and Nitish Mittal, also known to many of you, partner at Everest Group. So we're going to start, I think, with a little bit of this is a bit of a backdrop, Toby, you can ignore it if you like, but I'd like you just to give your perspective on the investment stance of large organisations when it comes to Gen AI, digital, whatever it might be. Don't worry if nothing of what you're about to say chimes with this stuff, with our findings from the study. Just give us your perspective on large organisations and investment.
I think this is right.
Way, you can go home.
I guess I feel like after Dave's comment earlier, I'm being kept out of prison by this topic of Gen AI, which is an evolution of many of the tech topics that we've been all working on for a number of periods of time. This is exactly where people are spending their money and their time and their focus now, and kind of rightly so, particularly around the cybersecurity one, and we've talked about a number of the topics related to that. There is a major change coming in the cyber threat that we face, again driven by topics like Gen AI, and people have to really ensure their organisations are resilient and protected to be able to address that. I talk about Gen AI is kind of three stages. Unless you can get the cloud stuff right, it's really hard to get the Gen AI stuff right. So we're all talking about all this fancy stuff with large language models. The biggest threat, quality of people's data and the accessibility of the data. I don't know if you'd agree with me. And then the advanced automation and cognitive all comes into the Gen AI piece as well. So the last three, I guess, come together.
And in terms of investment appetite, is there lots of appetite but no money yet? What's going on?
Well, I think the previous session talked about the investment appetite in the market broadly, which is challenged. Gen AI does offer the potential of significant cost savings. The bit that's difficult, and I describe it like, we haven't talked about this, but I describe it very much like 98, 99, I guess I am that old, was what digital did. And we're still only feeling the effects of digital now, right? We're still, talking about the theme of digital transformation. To embrace this technology properly, you have to reimagine your organisation. which is really hard, and that's a very grandiose statement. What does that actually mean? I think there are practicalities you can start with in 24, but it is an evolution of organisational constructs and how they go to market and where value is seen, which will last a lot longer.
Yep. And it does. And Toby, thanks for joining us, and the community here as well. We were just discussing before this, about this interesting LinkedIn poll you ran. Was it last week, right, where you asked people around where are they investing in Gen AI? And your work as a cross section of providers, but also enterprises. Does that tell you a little bit about where use cases are going actually right now? So we have some data on where it's moving from pilot to production, which we'll come to. But do you get a cross-sectional view that here are the things that people are prioritizing as they really think about where Gen AI works, not just the potential?
Yeah, look, I ran that poll because, like all of you, and no doubt, there's a lot of noise, but it's like, okay, so where do I start? So what? So what are we actually doing here, apart from talking about this stuff? And the feedback was validating, I guess, perspectives. I think where the technology is being used now is where it can be used without addressing really big topics like, what's the future of my organisation and how do I reimagine it? So where is it being used? It's being used in legal really well to assist with contract review and definition. It's being used in marketing really well to do creative production. Even last night, I was talking to my wife, who runs a very small but very global business, to say, hey, if you want to personalize your adverts in China and in North America, and you haven't got the production cost to do it historically, now you can, really cheap. Try it. It's being used in research, not very well. It's terrible. It's really inaccurate. Is that the right thing? Yeah.
It is, yeah. And thankfully, we still have a job, at least by the end of this panel.
Yeah. It's the biggest one, and I'm so delighted that the number 2 guy at Microsoft made my case for me this week with my old project, which carries my name, bizarrely, is in virtual agents and contact center. That is that's probably the biggest significant major use case right now. The one that will be interesting to this group, we can talk about either in this session or afterwards, is in managed services and managed operations. Fundamental change, data centers, fundamental change coming, maybe not this year, but people should be starting to make investments in those areas. Cybersecurity, fundamental change too.
Absolutely. And, we were talking a little bit about our research in this space, and the way I characterize end users and enterprises is that they're sort of in the third wave of their Gen AI journey and experiments. 30th of November 2022, everybody woke up to ChatGPT and life was never the same. The first 3 or 4 months, most people were in the first phase, which is figuring out, is this real or is this another metaverse moment? I think most people realize that this is real. Yes, the technology needs to be more cost effective and maybe it's not ready for a prime time, but there are fewer barriers to entry compared to the metaverse. The last 6 months and most of last year, we've seen people focus on the second phase of the journey, which is experiments and pilots. We saw CIOs get 1 to 3% of their budgets as a one-time war chest for Gen AI, even in a tough macro backdrop. And now I think where the conversation's pivoting to is, don't tell me as an enterprise where can Gen AI work. Tell me where does it actually work. And I think that's where we're going to see more pragmatic and more focused use cases this year. I think we have this whole framing, Julian, down the pack around which use cases are moving from pilot to production. We've mapped a bunch of different banks and industries and functions on it. Hopefully Gen AI can solve for some of our clicker issues sooner versus later. But what we're seeing is effectively what clients want to know is, now that we have spent 14, 15 months in this journey, I'm sure you got empirical data as a partner, as another enterprise on where it works. So help me prioritize that. And to Toby's point, we're seeing it a lot in contact centers. I was talking to a large tech vendor in the MarTech, marketing technology ecosystem last evening. Content supply chain and marketing is huge. I think it's a new total addressable market. We're seeing it a lot in IT operations as well. So I think the focus this year, in my opinion, is going to be around funneling down, focusing on use cases where the juice is worth the squeeze. And second, I think we're increasingly getting into an operational environment around Gen AI. Just like we had data and the early data movement moved to data ops, then we had ML and ML moved to ML ops. We're seeing this conversation around LLM ops. So Gen AI and what it does to the broader data ecosystem, I think is probably the the unwritten story of our times. And this is the pilot to production thing I was referencing, where we've looked at a bunch of US and European banks and where they are. And if you look at things like customer support, robo advisory, regulatory compliance, risk management, that's where people are moving faster into production than others. We have a cut like this for 60 different industries and use cases. So this is something we are constantly refreshing.
Anil, anything you'd throw into that?
Yeah, so I think from a pilot to production perspective, there is. I think that realistically, there's a fair way to go, right? So most of the stuff that we see is very heavily biased towards the POC and pilot side. But we expect that, or at least personally, I expect that the transition of Gen AI from hey, here's a shiny new object to play around with, to the real question being asked of hey, where is ROI and where can we get real value? I think that transition is going to be, or that time period is going to be lesser and lesser, right? So we have had all of these waves with different technologies, blockchain, metaverse, etc. And the time period during which that hype actually lasted has been pretty long. But since we have had so many of these, that experience actually has resulted in a shortening of that timeline. So very quickly in 2024, I expect to see, of course, some of these will ultimately just drop off, right? Some of the use cases, you see a lot of conviction behind it right now, but as and when the ROI doesn't pan out, those will just drop out. But a few will reach that escape velocity that you need, and it'll end up having disproportionate impact, right? So 2024, for me, I mean, that's really what I'm going to watch out for.
So we got 15 minutes into a discussion about Gen AI and the first mention of the word hype. Toby.
It's a lot of hype, but it's helpful. I mean, I view it, and I think the previous slide helped. It's a continuation of activities we've already started and where they're coming together. But there is some fundamental change that comes with it. So yes, there is some hype, but it's all of the other aspects, the cyber, the cloud, the automation, the data and AI, all comes together with Gen AI. To your hype point, there's one survey that I'm not going to name because it was a prior employer, I don't want to name them, that I thought was fascinating. It comes up to the talent point that we talked about earlier. CTOs think, 70% of CTOs surveyed, of 3,000 global CTOs surveyed, think they've got the skills in their organisation to address this. 30% of CEOs think they've got the skills to address this. And that's I think a bit about the hype, is that it's not about the technical skills, it's about how ready is the organisation to make the shift. I'm having conversations with organisations at the moment saying, what does and this is hype, sounds a bit hypey, what does an AI-enabled operations department look like? Or IT department, or legal department? And then, so on one side, you've got all of the analysts saying, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50% off costs. On the other hand, you've got departments going, how? What's the practical steps that I take? And I think the practical step is some of those elements. Cloudification, data quality is critical, boring but important. So if I was going to invest anywhere, I would invest in data quality, boring but important, foundational, not for just this year, for years to come. And then it's the pilot around deploying large language models, or even small language models, where you're looking at proprietary data sets that your organization may own. Those things aren't hype, but the robots taking over the world, I think is a little bit.
Yeah, so Toby, actually to that point, I think one of the critical things which we are starting to notice here, and that change needs to happen fairly quickly, is the mindset needs to change from where we were in 2023. And part of that mindset was, hey, Gen AI is a CIO or a CTO agenda. And in some ways, there was a parallel being drawn to cloud, while you can potentially draw that parallel from a benefit perspective or a potential perspective. Reality is the kind of the nature of those benefits are very much aligned to the business functions or business operations, right? So you're talking about productivity, you're talking about automation, and related change management. Everything actually sits within the business. So as a go forward, what you really require is, to your point, multidisciplinary teams where you have the cloud and data and all those components come in. But ultimately, the businesses accrue the benefit and they have to manage the change as well. So ultimately, I think business should end up becoming a key decision maker there, and also potentially the entity that funds it, as opposed to it being just simply an enterprise IT phenomenon.
And I think that's a very interesting point, Anil, because when we looked at the common archetypes of use cases that are moving from pilot to production, one of the common factors we found was that they often have a defined economic owner, and that helps get these approvals, because if it's everybody's problem, it's nobody's problem. And I think figuring out who's the sponsor, who's doing it, and where do these budgets come from, we've often seen be a pathway for some of this moving from just experiments and pilots to production. I think there's a risk factor that we haven't spoken about. I think in addition to GenAI and the first mention of hype, one thing that's becoming a bottleneck is the safety and the risk aspect. So, and there are two elements to it. One is obviously responsible AI, trust, and purposeful AI. But I think there's also a contracting risk, which again is not a glamorous topic to talk about, but it's a bottleneck for clients before they move it into production. What they're not clear is who owns the risk contractually, legally, from an indemnification perspective once we move it into production. Is it the system integrator or the service provider? Is it the core technology provider like Adobe or the hyperscaler? Is it the foundational model? We've seen Microsoft, we've seen others now come out and say we'll include it in our ELAs, but the answer to that is not necessarily clear. And for one of the stakeholder groups that we work a lot with, sourcing and procurement, that's a very, very fundamental question before this reaches that escape velocity. So I think solving for risk is another important topic, and having that defined economic owner, I think, is a critical pathway for success.
I totally agree. I mean, again, the stat on that, 50% of organizations have the foundational elements, not foundational models, AI policies, procurements, escalation, those things in place. Organizations aren't ready to go from pilot to production. And so one of the questions I think you asked me in prep was, where's the growth coming this year in new services? All of those foundational services, what's your AI ethics policy, what's your escalation policy, your data quality, your privacy, all of those are foundational services that do need to be procured this year to be ready for those organizations to take the step. From the more procurement side, I think there's a element of how ensuring that you can, this is a question to ask service providers, in terms of what are you doing here and where are you actually able to bring a savings over. And it may not be, I think a genuine answer from a service provider would be, I can't give you savings this year, but I can in future years if you partner with me and we collaborate on this. And I think that's a very honest and authentic way of doing it. Just one other point, as you mentioned it, around the ESG agenda and ethical sourcing, that needs looking into from 2 points. You talk about it from a risk point of view. One is these data centers that are powering these things that nobody actually sees are hugely energy hungry. I mean, there are investments being made in nuclear to cool data centers now, okay? So it's exploring that. So that is something organizations need to take seriously. And then the cyber threat that comes alongside these large language models and Gen AI introducing new cyber threats is something that is not well understood by organizations. And as we've found in many other areas, the bots and the bad actors tend to move quicker, and we learn through those actions. And that's real and present as well. So I think your point around risk is well made.
Yeah, I think the ESG point is really interesting. I'll just give a small anecdote. One of the things we found when we did, I think some of the base data for this comes from 50 CIO interviews from Fortune 200 companies end of last year. And one of the things we realized, and these are all people who've been at least 6 months in their journeys on Gen AI, so not just early movers, but people with some verifiable outcomes. And one of the things people are pointing out is you might not need a really, really large language model for everything. I think, there is this fascination with 5, 10, 15, 20 billion parameters, and I'm sure there'll be a few more numbers this year. But what people are finding out, is really depends on the use case. Just like we had this payload for workload conversation on cloud. Is public cloud, private, hybrid, poly cloud the right answer for you? The same thing's happening with LLMs. We're starting to see the emergence of tinier, smaller, more focused LLMs or micro utilities. And the analogy people use is, you don't really need a very expensive car if all you're going to do is go to the neighborhood grocery store and get a pint of milk. Similarly, you don't need to drink from this fire hose of Gen AI for every use case because A, it's power hungry, and B, it's really costly.
Yeah, I think I just want to add on to that. And when you talk about preparedness for generative AI, I think one of the things which we can probably all look forward to is the UAI Act and that the impact that it's going to have, right? Now, of course, we still have some time till it comes into effect properly. There will be harmonized standards coming in between. First, it has to be passed, but you can expect that to be set in motion at least pretty quickly. As an outcome of this act, one of the things enterprises will start to do, or they will have to do, is to figure out, hey, where is AI actually being used within the organization, right? So if you're talking about, we can talk about large language model, diffusion models, multimodal models, and so on. All we want to, but how many enterprises actually know where AI is being used currently, whether a big or a small model within their ecosystem?
And this has been for years. So, I was doing dynamic pricing, real-time decisioning-based pricing algorithms in 2012. So this is not new, and that's why I think we have to temper some of the hype around. But but what's happened is the regulator's now caught up, and now wants to know you to have an answer to that question.
There's nothing like a dampener on the hype.
Thanks very much.
Because in addition to cybersecurity risk and the damage that large data centers do to the environment, it also sounds like bloody hard work.
This is business change. This is the next wave of business change. I mean, it's tremendously. Let's do light and shade. It's tremendously exciting about the opportunity that can come through this technology. But it does require, as any technology, thoughtful, considered, well understood, a broad evaluation of where the impact is going to come from, and then to reimagine some of the business opportunities that can created around this as well. That's not happened because, to your point, it's been proof of concepts pilots with certain organisations, and 24 people are waking up and going, "Wait a minute! I'm looking for the next productivity boost. I'm looking to generate cost savings so that I can reinvest in the next wave of growth. This feels like a good thing. How do I use it to drive savings, but also invest in it to drive growth?" That's the hard conversation that I think needs to be had, because it does require both. As ever, the timescales for deliver the savings are not always the same as the timescales required for the investment growth. And I think that's the organisational challenge.
Anil, looks like you want to chime in.
Yeah, no, so I just want to chime in and make sure we're not going too negative on this, right? So while I mentioned that, some of these will drop off, the ones which will reach escape velocity, so to speak, or critical mass, they will have disproportionate impact, right? And you may even end up seeing disruptors come in your various spaces as well. So, not to undersell the impact of generative AI, but I think all of us agree that things need to be in place, and also we need to temper the expectation in the immediate term without putting proper frameworks in place, right? The other thing is, keep in mind, right now most of the adoption is happening off of the foundational models. So you have your large language models and multimodal models, etc. And adoption when it starts from a foundational or core technology layer is typically harder as well, right? On top of these foundational models, you will have applications come in which are built on top of those foundational models. So think of, for example, an industry LLM, right? Or sorry, not an industry LLM, but an industry chatbot rather, or maybe a product which designs your learning and development courses for you, right? Content generation, learning journeys, etc. So those kind of products which will also be specifically trained for particular use cases, right? They use the foundational model, you have the fine tuning on top, specifically trained, and all the nice bells and whistles which come with any sort of enterprise product, right? So it helps you integrate within your own tech stack. It helps you navigate things easier. UI UX is better. In essence, it makes the adoption much easier, right? So that part of the ecosystem coming through will round out adoption. In fact, I think it will start to push adoption pretty massively as well.
So before I throw the session open to questions from the floor, I'm going to ask you each for one prediction for Gen AI in 2024. Let's start with Nitish.
Yeah, thanks for not putting me on the spot. So I'm trying to come with a pithy statement. So I think more data, less dystopia. I think that would be my prediction for this year, which is, I think let's not talk about the hypothetical on where can it work, but where is it actually working? As I said, I think people are hungry for that empirical evidence. For enterprises, I think the implication is, you're not in this alone. B, you know what's better than being a first mover? It's being a fast follower. So see where your peers are at, map them on a journey like this, ask your providers on where they've done it, and learn from that and scale up. And for providers, I think you need to show more data based on how you're embracing Gen AI internally. I'm seeing that with a lot of enterprise clients. They say, if you're running these large delivery organizations, you tell us what benefits you've seen as a provider. So I'd say more data and less dystopia.
Toby.
I'm going to go for a slightly left field one, which is I think your partners will fundamentally change. Your core partners will fundamentally change this year. So you need to look at different, all large and mid-sized organizations will have a different set of partners, which will include providers of large language models and AI infrastructure.
Anil?
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with the application layer development, right? I suspect we'll start to see several new categories of applications in multiple areas. At least they'll start to pop up by this year or towards the end of this year, and the development of that application layer will continue well into the next couple of years as well.
Good. We have a question already over here.
Good morning. Thank you all for being up here. 72-part question on this one, but I was coming over the pond, there was a story I was reading about how a UK postal delivery service had a chatbot that went a little rogue and wrote a rap song about how horrible the company that produced the chatbot was, which is related to my question around, you talk about data. Data is the most important part, underlying structured data that you know is relevant to train your bot, or train your models on, excuse me. So how do you look at the advent of the trust and safety sector that acts upon training models? So you have human bias that gets replicated at a warp speed at a computational cycles. How do you keep in check that bias around when you're training these models? Because now it is proliferated globally, and immediately that it not only could have reputational harm, but incredible security effects around that. So that's part one. Part two is around how do you have enough education on the buy side? So procurement is now asked to do this. Now you have to think about governance. I think you said AI ethics. What's the Partners AI Governance Council look like? How do you now train a new evolution of procurement to think about issues that were once very, very deep in a vault around engineers? So now you're going to ask to procure possibly agent assist services. But how do you know that the agent assist services that are being delivered in real time through small language formats have been properly and ethically trained to answer those questions every single time? So education for buyers, and then on the trust and safety rise within this AI world we live in.
Okay.
Nitish, go for it.
So I'll take the second one first, and then we can all chime in on the first one. I think on the education part, I think it's first of all, it's absolutely crucial. I think this is a market that's getting made in front of our eyes. So there are no parallels or analogs. Yes, there are parallels with the cloud market, the ERP market, but just on much more accelerated timelines and on steroids. So I think in some ways there's no analog. So I think that there are two parts to what we're seeing in terms of what does successful education look like. One, I think, is you need a distinctive and a distinguished client advisory / advocacy model for this. I think this time what I see different with clients or end users is they're more open to partner ideas on this than say your classic BPO or AMS or infrastructure management team. because they know that there's that the playbook to deal with this doesn't exist. So they're more open to partner and seller ideas. So I think to Toby's point around a new partner ecosystem, I think anything that partners can do to showcase early learnings from the trenches, to my point around data, I think you'll find them more often than not more receptive to it. The second is, I think the sourcing thing is very, very important, as you said. I think we are almost seeing in our CIO interviews, people say, I almost need a special purpose vehicle for sourcing this, right? My current sourcing methodologies are not, will just slow me down. I talk outcomes, they talk rate cards, and it's not sourcing's problem. That's all they've been measured on, so I won't fault them for it. So I think you almost need a special purpose sourcing vehicle and just a top-down mandate to drive it, in almost, not in a vacuum, but with special powers. Obviously, that's not a scalable model, so ultimately you need to get sourcing along that journey, but not let that be a bottleneck.
Toby.
Shall I take the thorny first part of the question, which was great? I love the question. Thank you. Just to remind, which is to play back. It was around given that the models can go rogue and risk. What's the way that organisations should try and address that? If I paraphrase it correctly, I think we've got to work out which. We are so immature to work out which models are right for which use case. So you've got proprietary large language models, which are trained on data which is in some cases under legal dispute. You've got open source large language models, which are just coming to the market and the hot new thing. You've then got small language models, and then you've got proprietary data to form your own language models. Which foundational model is right for which use case needs to be determined to develop production systems. So in your example of virtual agents, I think there is some that's more developed because of the cognitive services that are foundational, voice, speech, etc., that can be used to drive that. So there is a lot more of that that's established, and the way that I think organisations will procure is they'll hide behind a cloud service provider and outsource that risk to the cloud service, which is probably the safe bet, but what we've done 10 times before in the last number of cycles. But in terms of internal use cases, I think there's some evolution. The biggest use case that I think people should be exploring internally, and I heard from Microsoft last year, this is what they were doing, was for internal proposal writing. Because everybody likes more sales, right? So that's a really good thing. But if you think about what you need to do to ease your proposal writing and have a greater velocity of tailored proposals going out the door, you need your data well structured, you need it in one place, you need to look at your pricing decisions, so it flashes out a lot of these things you need to think about, and it actually drives huge value from the organisation, and I'm pretty sure that every CEO would sponsor it. So that's the one that I think is a really good starting point, because it starts to flush out the questions. But fundamentally, there's a landscape of foundational models. You need to pick the right one for the right use case in the right organisation, and we don't understand enough about that yet.
Yeah, so I'm just going to add to that. I think, so part of the question was around, how do you figure out what data you use, right, to train it or maybe fine tune it. And part of it is also how do you control for that risk of, essentially hallucination. So my take on this is I don't think there's a silver bullet there, honestly. With large language models, they are going to hallucinate. They are going to be extremely difficult to explain. So, those kind of situations are going to continue to persist as long as you use these transformer-based architectures with essentially neural networks, right? Unless there's a different approach, that will still be there. But to my mind, that's not necessarily a complete roadblock, right? In fact, the argument that I make is, hey, most of us can't explain what is going on in our head either, right? So, but we still use it, right? And then, similarly with hallucinations, in fact, if you're able to make up a great story, it's often considered a good skill, right? If you're a great storyteller, great salesperson, etc., etc. So it still has its utility, right?
Can I just give an example that I think will bring this to life to make it slightly less ethereal? So I do a lot in healthcare. There's a model called BioGPT, which runs, and there's a database in the med industry called PubMed. It's got 17 million articles on it, super amazing, doctors use it forever. BioGPT gets greater than human accuracy on effectively reading 17 million articles. So you want to know about a particular disease. I always talk about diabetes in Mali. I don't know why, but that's the example I always give. Then you can use this to do it. It's greater than human accuracy. greater than human accuracy, doctors are scared to death to use it. Why? Because they're in the world of 99% is right. But actually, we know that doctors are actually operating at probably 80% effectiveness, but it's not disclosed. And we have to get comfortable with this one way or another. So we, because our traditional models have been doctors at 80%, doctors search for 99%, never deliver it, and a bot can deliver 82%. That's quite hard. It just brings it to life, I thought. Sorry.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, that's a great point as well. Often the accuracy of these systems is actually better than the corresponding accuracy for humans as well, right? So that's a great point. But in order to contain the risks, I think what enterprises will need to do is also figure out, what are my critical use cases where I really have the need for explainability, right? And some of that comes through regulation as well. So if you're doing like a loan approval based on some sort of automated credit check, you need to be able to explain that, right? Because otherwise you're open to lawsuits and all those kind of things, bias, discrimination, etc. You can't just go to the court and say that, hey, ChatGPT told me, so I approved the loan, or I didn't, right? So those kind of use cases, you would want to take a very measured approach. You can still use AI, maybe just not like very large neural network, right, which acts as a black box. Use more explainable models. In other cases, you can still have human in the loop, right? So you can definitely have human in the loop. So the productivity goes up massively as long as you, again, going back to some of the points made earlier, I think one of the critical things here for me is definitely change management, and also being open to changing processes and changing business models themselves. We all have this tendency to shoehorn generative AI into existing stuff, right? And when we're hoping for dramatic change, but you need to take some risk on that front if you really want to have that massive effect. But at the same time, I'm also going to temper it by saying that you need to control for those risks, right? Human in the loop is a great way.
I think that's a great place. We've got time for one more question. Great place to stop. One more question if you keep your answers brief, because we've run over time a little bit, but we want to try and rein it in now. So,
thank you. I think this will be a brief one. You mentioned earlier that most organisations don't have or aren't ready to move from pilot into production. Is that they don't have the internal skills, the data isn't ready, or that they aren't ready to move with the skills of a third-party provider as well?
So the surveys suggest that it's internal skills. I would suggest the data isn't ready to.
excellent. To the point.
How's that for a succinct answer?
Perfect. And Nitish, you want to add anything?
No. I don't want us to. I agree. I think.
Yes, that's fine. You agree. Anil, do you agree too?
All good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Put your hands together for the fantastic panel.